Well, after that move by the UK, might Hamas be looking a bit further afield for some diplomatic support? Well, last month, the deputy chairman of the Hamas political bureau, Musa Abu Marzouk, took part in a conference in Istanbul. It was titled China and the Palestinian Question. The conference sought to leverage tensions between China and the West to advance an anti-Israel agenda. But China already has deep financial ties with Israel in agriculture and infrastructure, for example. So would Beijing really be willing to forfeit that in order to support the Palestinian cause? Well, joining us now is Dale Aluf, Director of Research and Strategy at the Sino-Israel Global Network and Academic Leadership. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, it is clear to see what would be in it for Hamas to have a world giant such as China behind them. But what would Beijing gain from cutting ties with Israel?
I don't think Beijing would have too much to gain from cutting ties with Israel, and I think that its support for Hamas is largely restricted to the political realm.
But might China use the Palestinian issue against the United States in some way?
Well, we've seen this happen in the most recent conflict between Hamas and Israel in May of this year. The Chinese were incredibly vocally anti-Israel. They called for 3 emergency meetings at the UN Security Council and condemned Israel's actions. And, you know, much of these polemics were actually directed towards America and to discredit America for its, for policies, that it's not happy with in China, such as, the Western regions in Xinjiang and what China is allegedly doing there with the Uyghurs and Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And, by involving itself in the Palestinian conflict and isolating Israel, it kind of used it to discredit the American position.
And I mentioned that China is heavily invested in Israel. I mean, China has built ports, tramways, it owns agriculture companies here. I mean, China does have a significant investment in this country, doesn't it?
Most certainly. China's investment in Israel has increased significantly since the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1992. Bilateral trade is, above $13 billion US. Chinese investment is flowing into Israel and has been for the past decade, predominantly into agriculture, but also into the innovation technology sectors and infrastructure. So between 2002 and 2020, we've seen almost $20 billion invested in Israel. And that's actually, that's what we know about. Israel is not, it does not beholden companies to report investments over a certain amount. So it's estimated by some people that this investment is actually much more.
And what is Beijing's usual stance on the Palestinian issue? Does it have a strong position either way?
The position of Beijing has been relatively consistent for decades. The Chinese support the establishment of a Palestinian state in line with the 1967 borders, so it supports essentially a 2-state solution.
And you mentioned the widely documented treatment of the Muslim Uyghurs in China. Where does that leave Hamas?
I'm not sure what you mean by where that leaves Hamas.
Well, why would Hamas pursue ties with China and at the same time not acknowledge what is happening to its Muslim brothers in parts of China, in Xinjiang province?
I mean, I can't speak on behalf of why Hamas would...
No, sure, but just exploring the potential for a relationship.
I think that they feel that they have to gain from, cooperating with China. The Chinese, like I said, have supported the Palestinian cause historically. The Chinese have been able to cordon off the political from the economic. So while they provide a lot of economic cooperation with Israel, they don't really provide so much material benefits or have not yet provided so much material benefits to the Palestinian authorities. And perhaps Hamas is seeking to leverage that. But I think that what's really happened is that, Beijing's support for Hamas, or rather the anti-Israel stance they took in May, has perhaps emboldened them to think that they could kind of interfere in relations with Israel by leveraging their relations with China.
And just finally, looking more broadly at the region, where do Arab states stand on the rivalry between the US and China? Do they tend to take sides, or do they prefer to stay out of it?
I mean, not just the Arab states, but many countries around the world, including the Arab states, have openly stated that they do not intend on taking a side in the US-China rivalry. This has been made clear in statements by the foreign minister of Dubai. We see it in Egypt's behavior. They welcome lots of Chinese investment. China's building one of the biggest cities in Egypt, but they still welcome material, military and diplomatic support from the US as well as Russian hardware. So they're hedging their bets all the time. Saudi Arabia has recently found China as its biggest trading partner, but at the same time, it still sees the US and the West as its key military supporters. So there really isn't so much incentive for these countries to choose a side.
Dale Aluf, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.